with these survey results in hand, I'm able to take that information and run it up the flagpole to the senior management and to talk about these are the issues of the day. These are the things we need to be thinking about getting ahead of. And frankly, getting buy-in from senior management and boards around, how do we prepare for this? We were really convinced that this is an incredibly useful tool to our clients to have those open discussions.
Welcome to Disputed, a Norton Rose Fulbright podcast. And in this episode, we're talking about Norton Rose Fulbright's annual Litigation Trends Survey, the longest running litigation-focused survey of in-house counsel. NRF has conducted the survey for 18 years, led by the US, but in response to significant interest from Canadian clients, this is the first year that in-house counsel in Canada have also participated. In November last year, the firm polled 437 senior in-house counsel from the US and Canada who shared their experiences and opinions on disputes-related topics impacting their organizations. Participants represented each of our industry sectors, with more than half of respondents working for organizations with more than $1 billion in annual revenue. Key among the findings was concern over employment and labor disputes, cybersecurity threats, regulatory scrutiny, class actions, and evolving ESG-related suits. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the overwhelming expectation among US and Canadian in-house counsel was that litigation risk was going to increase in 2023, or at least stay the same. We take a deeper dive into these results with two guest speakers from Canada and the US. Our guest speaker from Canada is our National Chair of Litigation, Jennifer Teskey, who practices corporate and commercial litigation with an emphasis on class actions, securities, accounting, regulatory, and energy-related matters. Jennifer is also the Canadian head of our financial institutions sector. Jennifer is joined by Sandeep Savla, the co-head of regulatory, investigations, securities, and compliance in our U.S. firm. Sandeep's practice focuses on civil litigation and white-collar investigations involving securities, financial markets, tax, and financial products. In his 20 years of practice, Sandeep has acted in almost every major industry-wide financial investigation before U.S., federal, state, and foreign authorities. We hope this episode will be useful information for general counsel and senior litigators in decision-making related to exposure mitigation and litigation management. Thanks for listening.
Jennifer, Sandeep, welcome to the podcast and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about Norton Rose Fulbright's Litigation Trends Survey? What is its purpose and why should companies be interested in the results?
Sure. What we're really aiming at through the Litigation Trends Survey is to get a clear picture of the issues of the day that our clients have both recently faced and are facing into the coming year. And it really helps us to set the table around the litigation and regulatory landscape that our clients are facing, and frankly, how we can best prepare and advise them into 2023. I should note that the survey is not new. It has been running for 18 years now in the United States. This year, though, I'm excited to report that Canada participated in the survey. In so doing, we polled in-house counsel at a whole variety of Canadian institutions around their 2022 experiences and again, what they're expecting to trend into 2023. And as we all know, litigation trends have a tendency of finding their roots in U.S. litigation. And so it's also a helpful goalpost, we think, for our clients to get a sense of what might be coming down the pike from a Canadian perspective based on the U.S. experience.
Mm-hmm.
So can you guys tell us about the survey process and methodology?
Sure. So just in terms of the process itself, the survey started out with a formal survey conducted of in-house counsel. We had upwards of 400 participants. In terms of the industries that we reached out to, it really is a full cross section of all industry participants, everything from retail, financial services, energy, healthcare, technology, construction, media, and others. And really, what we were aiming at was to get at the types of disputes that our clients find themselves involved in, where they see future risk and estimates around what the 2022 state of play was and what they're seeing into 2023, and trying to ascribe certain values as to why our clients may think that certain risks are increasing or decreasing. And for example, the kind of feedback that we received is, our clients are expecting greater regulatory scrutiny coming down the pike. They, in the cyber space, expect, increased hacker sophistication. And on the employment side, they're expecting more employee demands and potential union activity, particularly as companies and their employees head back to the workplace in a post-COVID world. Something else that we canvassed is our clients' respective levels of litigation preparedness. So what are they doing? What are they thinking about doing to try and ward off or mitigate litigation risk? And in addition to the formal survey portion of the analysis, we also wanted to supplement that analysis by conducting interviews of certain of our clients to help inform the survey questions and the raw data that was received through the survey.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a combination of the qualitative with the quantitative. And I think it is interesting, as you point out, that Canada has joined the survey for the first time this year. And also when we think about how Canadian counsel can make use of the results, not just from a Canadian perspective, but also looking to the changes that happen in the US and how they are a marker of what is to come.
I think what's interesting is for those who are or were in-house counsel, and I used to be in-house counsel as head of litigation at a bank, is that you really get to see what industry participants are doing in a cross-sectional way. Often when you are working at a company or an organization, you know what your entity does, you know how to advise your management, but it's fascinating to be able to see what others in the industry are facing, and that often informs how you advise senior management or the board. One of the interesting things to me was legal spend and how prominent that was for the survey participants. And to me, that reflects the high level of sophistication and the ever increasing level of sophistication that in-house counsel and in-house corporate departments have. And I always say, and I said when I was in-house, when in-house counsel use outside counsel, it is not about the in-house capability, it's about the in-house capacity. In-house lawyers typically nowadays have the capability to do most of what outside counsel do. It's a question of capability and having the bandwidth. And I think what we're seeing with the increased insourcing by in-house counsel is reflective of that trend. And so when is it that in-house counsel go to outside counsel is the truly interesting question, I think, behind these survey findings. And what we've seen both at Norton Rose Fulbright, but what I also experienced when I was in-house, is you're really looking for outside counsel who will partner with you to achieve your business objectives and solve business problems.
So you alluded to some of the findings. I wonder if we can focus in on that. So perhaps Sandeep, can you talk us through some of the top level highlights that came out of the survey?
I think, as Jennifer said, there's an increased focus on employment and labor and a spotlight on workplace issues, particularly as we're coming out of COVID. We're seeing more people in the workplace environment, and then with the overlay of DEI and ESG. And that probably dovetails with the findings regarding ESG litigation, which only a minority of respondents reported ESG litigation, but more than a quarter reported deepening exposure and anticipated litigation going forward. And we are certainly seeing that in terms of what our clients are sensitive to and what they are increasingly attuned to. Class actions are a perennial feature of the landscape. Regulatory scrutiny, a majority of respondents reported some sort of regulatory proceeding or scrutiny, and we are certainly seeing that on the ground at Norton Rose Fulbright, and we're seeing that in a multi-jurisdictional way. Obviously, business is borderless. These problems are often borderless. Regulatory scrutiny is often borderless. And so we see a lot of multi-jurisdictional regulatory proceedings and investigations. Cybersecurity and data protection, again, a perennial feature of what we deal with. So I think those are the hot topics that the respondents picked up on, which actually dovetail with what we're finding on the ground.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Sandeep. From my practical vantage point as well, like you say, it really does seem to match up well with the trends that we're seeing on this side as external counsel. Well, what can you guys tell us about any differences between what Canadian and US respondents to the survey are reporting? Are there differences on either side of the border? Are there any kind of different headwinds?
There are some differences, albeit modest differences, as between Canada and the United States. But certainly, Canadian respondents seem to identify things like market volatility, and a movement towards arbitral proceedings, for example, as things that they indicated they expect to see more of, and influencing litigation in 2023. And I think, as you mentioned, anecdotally, as litigators looking at this, it's not a huge surprise that we see an uptick in anticipated arbitral proceedings, for example, owing to the fact that in COVID, you had courts closed and you had parties taking matters into their own hands and structuring arbitrations in lieu of civil litigation. And I think, frankly, parties have now come to realize that, setting their own agendas and being able to work perhaps more nimbly in the disputes context via arbitration has a certain level of attractiveness as well. There's no doubt that it's a quicker way to an end resolution. But just to pick up on the market volatility piece, so Canadian respondents, as I said, did indicate that they anticipate that market volatility will lend itself to a larger uptick in disputes. Similarly, the risk of an impending recession, rising interest rates, heightened inflation, all of these factors were pointed to as potential issues that could influence increased disputes for our clients. Canadian respondents also said that they anticipate an uptick in regulatory exposure in 2023, believing that this is an area that they're going to need to be spending more time on as compared to US counterparts. And what I would say, the takeaway certainly for us is, just a good reminder that when advising our clients, we need to be looking at the full picture. And in-house counsel should always be very mindful of, in that civil litigation or arbitral context, what could the follow-on regulatory implications be, and to be looking at things in a very holistic way rather than in a siloed, civil litigation lens, for example, only kind of way. Canadian respondents also identified a heightened concern as compared to US counterparts on the cybersecurity side, pointing to data protection, data privacy as factors that they have an increased concern around in terms of civil litigation in 2023. Again, not a terrible surprise, not only given the increased prevalence of cyber incidents, but as well given heightened regulatory scrutiny around such issues as well.
Mhm. I think the regulatory piece that you mentioned is something we want to hone in on, because Sandeep, you're the co-head of our regulatory investigations and securities and compliance practice in the US. So can you go a bit deeper on the findings when it comes to anticipations for regulatory investigations and also internal investigations? What are your thoughts around those results?
I think the results really mirror what we are seeing, which is I've called it more muscular enforcement by regulatory authorities. At least in the US, there was a perception that under the prior administration, um, federal enforcement had scaled back. With the current administration, what we're definitely seeing is more enforcement, more investigations, and just a much more muscular attitude towards how regulators and prosecutors deal with companies, their attitudes towards penalties and the collateral consequences on companies of penalties has changed under the current administration. There's always an element of regulatory competition between various regulators. So you often see the US regulators competing with foreign regulators about certain market conduct, penalties, and what have you. In the US, you see regulatory competition between state actors and federal actors, and that continues to be a feature of the landscape. I'll just say that with respect to some of the differences between the US and Canada, it's once again an instance where the Canadians are ahead of the US. You know, I'm surprised that the US respondents have not yet said that market volatility is a contributing factor to what they're seeing, because certainly those of us who have been through a rising interest rate environment in the past, or have dealt with a market environment that's on the cusp of a recession, have seen what typically happens, which is a search for yield. And once you have a search for yield, in other words, people seeking out a higher interest rate than the current prevailing yield, you see all sorts of litigation coming up around products that are being offered, suitability to clients, and regulators jumping into that space. When you see the sort of structural issues that have come out of COVID, for example, an increased work from home environment, that has an impact on office leases and commercial mortgage-backed securities. So I think this is an instance where, once again, the Canadians are ahead of the US. And I suspect, if I'm reading the tea leaves, we're going to be seeing much more of market volatility and high interest rates playing out in the US and in an international environment as well.
I think that intersect with the political that you allude to as well is also interesting when considering the regulatory landscape, because as you mentioned, there was kind of a scaling back under the previous administration, and under Biden's administration, there seems to be a ramping up. And there's also an ideological difference, I'm assuming, between at state level versus federal level. What would your advice be to companies to manage that fluid minefield, if that's not an oxymoron?
I will say that one of the things the current administration is emphasizing a lot is the value of compliance programs. Now, again, we've heard this from practically every administration, but this one seems to be saying that they will really evaluate and kick the tires on the efficacy of a compliance program. The DOJ in the US recently released guidance, I think maybe a week ago, saying that one of the gating factors for whether you get a declination or cooperation credit is whether there is already existing an efficacious compliance program, an effective compliance program. So I think that's going to put a lot of focus for companies on putting together compliance programs that try and target areas where there's risk to the enterprise. So that's one of the key things we're going to be seeing, I think. There's also a continued focus on individual accountability. So when companies are looking and conducting internal investigations or responding to regulators, a feature of this is going to be really digging into who did what when.
Mm-hmm. And we recorded an episode recently on remediation agreements in Canada. And obviously, they're only available for a small subset of criminal offences in Canada at the moment. But I understand in the US, deferred prosecution agreements are potentially available for a wider range of regulatory offences. Are you seeing any trends in the use of deferred prosecution agreements coming alongside these regulatory changes?
Yes, the deferred prosecution agreement has been a favorite tool of US regulators. The idea is that if you agree with the government that they will defer prosecution for a certain number of years and no misconduct takes place in that time period, no recurrence of the conduct, then that prosecution will be dropped, is the idea behind a deferred prosecution agreement. There is a landscape of what prosecutors in the US can do. They can decline to take any action. They can actually pursue a actual indictment against a company. So the deferred prosecution remains a tool to incentivize cooperation. The other tool that U.S. prosecutors use, and it fell out of favor with the prior administration. It's I think more open to the current administration, is the use of corporate monitors, where the DOJ installs a monitor to oversee compliance by a company. So those are the things that we are seeing in the US, and I think we'll continue to see.
One of the things from listening to you both speak about the survey results, I find interesting is the spotlight on employment and labor issues. And in a sense, I don't find it surprising because practically every in-house counsel I know who's in a big institution has some exposure to an employment and labor portfolio. It's kind of the most consistent aspect of so many in-house counsel's jobs, because no matter what's happening with sales, no matter what's happening with markets or mergers or whatever, people are always coming and going, and there's always tension around that, given the importance of work to the sort of human experience. But it's interesting to hear even still there is an emphasis on employment and labor. Now we've done a couple episodes of the podcast talking about the return to work and some of the interesting issues that are highlighted with all of that. But can you tell us a bit more about what people are really concerned about in that space?
We heard pretty uniformly from our clients across both Canada and the United States that they are anticipating increased exposure to employment and labor disputes in 2023, in part owing to COVID and again, the post-COVID world and rising tensions potentially on return to work policies, efforts towards unionization, heightened regulatory scrutiny, issues like pay equity. It runs the gamut that all of the issues historically that have been on the table are continuing to be on the table, and if anything, are heightened by virtue of the return to office. There's no doubt that our employment and labor team on both sides of the border will tell you that the in-office work environment, just by virtue of what it is, really does increase that risk of allegations of discrimination and or harassment. And so it also comes as no terrible surprise that there is a view that there may be more litigation and frankly, more internal investigations around such issues. This as well, when you dovetail into other things like the enhanced focus on social justice and issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it's not surprising to hear that this may be prompting more people to raise issues and complaints that could turn into civil litigation. In the United States specifically, it was identified that increased activity from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is also fueling more workplace-related litigation around discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. and that issues around wage and hour disputes, that's also percolating. Lastly, I would say that in terms of the data set that we obtained through the survey results, it's clear that these issues pervade all business types. So perhaps not a huge surprise that, we're everything from healthcare to logistics, energy, retail, technology, E&L issues are identified as really a key risk to all of the businesses and all of those industries.
Yeah, and thinking about them as sort of compartmentalized issues is probably the wrong way to approach it, given that, I'm thinking about the layoffs, for example, recent layoffs in the tech sector that are, I'm sure, animating a lot of the answers that go into a survey like this about people's concerns and the risk of layoffs. But of course, that's a risk that's connected to the maturation of an industry, market condition, market volatility that you've already talked about. So these things are they're so cross-connected. It's really interesting, but obviously across industries as well. What about in the ESG side? I can tell you from my practice now, I have started to see an increase in actual ESG litigation, ESG class actions relating to, conduct, international conduct questions. So I can sense why that would be on someone's dashboard, but what did the survey tell you about that particular space?
I think what the responses show is increasing attunement to ESG issues. We're certainly seeing that. The SEC has proposed climate disclosure rules that are very contentious in the US with respect to certain categories of companies. And I think the cases that we're seeing on the regulatory front are really plain disclosure cases under the rubric of ESG. A company says it's doing one thing, and in actuality, it's doing something else. It has been subject to criticism in the US that there's increased politicization of ESG rules, and it fits into a broader trend where at least some critics say the current administration in the US is trying to legislate through regulation or is trying to regulate through enforcement. And let's not forget the S part in the ESG, which is the social part of it. We are seeing increased investigations as to labor practices along the supply chain, increased scrutiny when you're dealing with labor practices in developing countries that make products that are then consumed by the developed world. And then just with labor practices, increased scrutiny on the hiring and work conditions of classes of workers.
I was just going to add that the other piece that we're obviously seeing as well is a very significant uptick in shareholder activism in this space, where you're seeing shareholder proposals and frankly, some of those proposals gaining traction in a way that we have not seen in years past. And that frankly, no matter what the type of corporation we're talking about, no one is immune to that kind of activity. So no doubt a very significant uptick in the shareholder activism space and increased concerns around proxy battle activity and the associated follow-on litigation that often results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Sandeep's reference as well to the S and the focus on labor and human rights abuses in supply chains will also be really interesting to watch in Canada in 2023, because Canada's version of their modern slavery legislation is about to go through its third reading and is expected to come into law in 2023. So that will be interesting to follow. And we have two episodes already looking at that modern slavery legislation and also comparing it with the regimes in Australia and certain regimes in Europe too. Another point I want to ask about the ESG trends, though, is, and I take your point, Jen, about the increased shareholder activism, but there is also a bit of a trend in kind of anti-ESG activity now, and particularly when we've got an impending recession, higher interest rates, higher inflation, are we seeing certain groups of shareholders actually saying, show us the monetary value of what your sustainability policies that you're implementing? Can you talk a bit about that anti-ESG trend?
Yeah, there is a certain anti-ESG wing, particularly in the United States. Some state regulators have issued what's been termed anti-ESG requests, and more fundamentally, there's a movement to say, well, if you're a company, your legal obligation is to maximize profits for your shareholders. So, and whether you subscribe to this or not, some critics say it's impossible to reconcile that with ESG goals, because by definition, when you start accommodating ESG related factors, you're not going to maximize value for shareholders. So the minefield, I think, in big picture terms for companies is going to be how to navigate the obligation to exercise business judgment and maximize value for shareholders versus reconciling that with some of the ESG initiatives we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Who was it? I'm going to get this wrong. Was it BlackRock who issued that open letters, setting out what their expectations were for sort of the breadth of considerations that a modern investee target company has to bring to the table for them to be engaged? I mean, it's an interesting push-pull with that philosophy. Obviously, people are going to have different views, but when that ends up as the mess that internal counsel has to deal with, I mean, to Jennifer's point about shareholder activism, I mean, we work on activist situations all the time, both for target companies and sometimes working with activists. And for internal counsel facing those, there's not really any difference between being involved in a major proxy fight and being involved in major litigation. And often the two are intertwined and there's a litigation component. So you see all these challenges, all these tensions, all these risks and concerns landing back in the lap of in-house counsel, have to try to sort them out either on their own using that depth of resource, Sandeep, that you were talking about earlier, or with the collaboration of external counsel. Jennifer, you mentioned the concept of sort of litigation preparedness earlier. I mean, what flavor do you get for what people are actually doing to try to ward off threats before they land at the door?
We really heard three clear messages on this one. Specifically, counsel identified the need to bolster and tighten existing contracts as one, which I'll come back to in a sec. Secondly, they indicated an intention of increased training of employees on litigation risk. And third, they indicated an intention to embed lawyers into business operations more fully. And so just going through those quickly, on the bolstering and tightening of contracts, the types of clauses that in-house counsel were looking at revisiting and either wholesale amending or at a minimum tweaking were things like arbitration clauses. So as I was alluding to earlier, this notion of let's give ourselves some flexibility, let's aim to rather than force civil litigation, and let's at least have the flexibility to perhaps consider arbitration. Similarly, forum clauses were something that in-house counsel identified as something that warrants a second look. And we know, of course, as litigators looking at it, that there may not even be a clear forum clause in a particular agreement. And there's no doubt that forum motions are not necessarily something that you want to be addressing right out of the gate. And so having some clarity around where litigation and or arbitration shall sit in the context of a dispute, and making sure in most cases, frankly, that it's on home turf, that those disputes are being adjudicated. Termination clauses also, and making sure that what they need in terms of termination for convenience versus for breach, that those provisions were clearer heading into 2023. On the training of employees on litigation risks, things that in-house counsel identified as being really key learnings included things like, when to negotiate, when to litigate, identifying opportunities to settle along the way. And again, I'd say those findings come as no terrible surprise, because generally speaking, the theme was, let's look for opportunities to negotiate rather than litigate in 2023. And as well, how can we head off litigation at the pass potentially? So how can we put an end to disputes before they become monumental issues to a particular organization? Lastly, on the embedding lawyers into business operations, the thinking here really seemed to be that by embedding lawyers into the business, obviously you're increasing that dynamic and level of trust as between in-house counsel and the business, and helping to, again, potentially ward off disputes before they become bigger issues for the business.
I'll just say that I'll endorse what Jennifer said, and I'll just add an overlay from the in-house perspective, wearing my prior in-house hat. It can be very difficult to explain to senior management why you are expending resources and cost before a litigation or investigation has actually hit. And so these are concepts of avoided costs are great in theory, but very hard to actually explain to senior management why you're seeking authorization to undertake these sort of diligence exercises. And so being able to point to a survey and say, look, this is what the market at large is saying, and if we don't do it, we're going to be lagging in terms of our ability to react, is a very powerful tool. So I think that's very useful. The other thing I'll say is it's incredibly difficult to prepare for litigation. So we all try and think of different ways that litigation could arise. We look at market trends, we look at what's happening with employees and political trends, but the reality is you often get blindsided by an investigation or litigation. The other way to approach it is to also look at incentives. And you see from the recent DOJ guidance in the US, where they say, they'll be looking at the incentives that are provided to senior executives, and also for companies to take away prior compensation, to claw back compensation when misconduct has been identified. Another way of approaching it in a sort of more holistic way is to look at compensation and how it's awarded and the various incentives, and then to target the conduct around that. But the big takeaway, I think, from this survey is that litigation preparation is important, and I think the survey makes it easier for in-house counsel to have those conversations with senior management and boards.
Mm-hmm.
Sandeep, Jennifer, this has been extremely enlightening and a good introduction, I think, for anyone listening, if they want to jump into the survey results and our commentary online about it as well. So thank you so much. And I think we'll probably be back to you to talk about future surveys or more in-depth issues in relation to your own very interesting legal practices. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Disputed. If you'd like to find out more about this topic or how to contact our guests, please visit nortonrosefulbright.com/disputed. Also, if you have any questions, feedback, or topics that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, please do email us at disputed@nortonrosefulbright.com. And if you would like to hear more, please subscribe to Disputed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.